second score. And Devonport, look at that. Now that tells you what discipline is all about. The man who's played in the premiership sides telling the youngster what self-discipline's all about.
That's unusual for the coach to come down to the boundary line, usually over the phone.
Awkward handball. Newport attacks the goal. Low goes the ground. It bounces. Kelly will probably run it towards the boundary line. He's caught. Devonport. Craven's on his own in the goal square. Devonport puts his eights in front. Sensational stuff here at the MCG. 80,000 people are watching a thriller.
Well, we look back at our next special guest. If we reflect on 1987 for St Kilda, it was a very significant year. Nicky Winmar would debut for the club. Nathan Burke would debut for the club. Danny Frawley would take over as captain. Tony Lockett would win a Brownlow medal and a Coleman medal. And Ken Sheldon would arrive at the club as well from Carlton. He would play 53 games for the Saints over 3 seasons before taking over as coach in 1990 from a club legend in Darryl Baldock, and he would lead St Kilda back into the finals for the first time in 18 years in the 1991 season. And whilst this current drought hadn't been 18 years, it's great to see St Kilda back in the finals, and it's good to reflect on that time. And Ken, welcome to Unplugged, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And yeah, you brought back a lot of memories in your introduction.
Now, I guess when you arrived at the club, so you've come from a very successful team where you played in premierships at Carlton. You arrived at St Kilda, which had a very different history. When you walked in the club on day one, did you envisage in 3 years' time I'll be coach, and in 4 years' time we'll be back in the finals for the first time in nearly 2 decades? I can't imagine you would have had all of that scripted out.
No, that's for sure. When I walked in, what I wanted to do was get to know everybody's names and get to understand how the club could work. That was, and enjoy my football. I'd had a couple of rough years with injury. And, as many players know over their journey, you can get branded. I had to sort of try and break that. So, yeah, it was about getting yourself prepared, setting yourself for, the year that was ahead and applying yourself not every week, but also every day and every hour of every day so you could play and make a good contribution to your new environment. So I really enjoyed those years. We weren't that successful on field, but, we had a wonderful coach in Darryl Baldock, and he was recruited across from Tasmania and changed his lifestyle, for the Saints. And we had a wonderful president in Travis Pays, and, they were really passionate about the club, and we were really going pretty well on our way sort of from the doldrums, as to speak. Not a lot of money, not a lot of facility, not a lot of depth in our playing list. But, things started to change, like the Trevor Barker, Robbie Elphingston, the Greg Burns, those type of players were instrumental. And a year before, in 1986, Peter McConville and Wow Jones had come down from Carlton. And they're two of my best mates. And it's why Alex Marcoux, Ian Muller and myself basically came down the Nepean Highway, as it was in those days. And, great times, one of the best things ever done.
And a bit of a two-parter to start off. Firstly, how did you end up at St Kilda? What was that process from leaving Carlton to arriving at Moorabbin? And secondly, what were those first few weeks like? As Parko mentioned earlier, you had a really successful career at Carlton, 3 premierships and leading goal kickers and all that sort of stuff. What was it like walking into the door of a club that historically is not successful, hadn't had that success that you had had, and was 15 years since the last final series? Yeah,
you sort of positioned that question pretty well. I was going to be an assistant coach at East Fremantle, and I was over there in Perth when Murray Ablett, the St Kilda GM of footy and recruiting in front of turned up at our hotel. And amongst other things, we had a reasonable weekend. and then
as you did back then.
between that sort of influence and that of a couple of great mates, as I said, in Wow Jones and particularly Peter McConville, You know, I thought about it, and I thought we had 4 children, and to take them all the way to the other side of the country, I thought, well, it's realistic, and also to play in a top competition, right? Now, the Saints weren't in the top of the top competition, but I thought, wow, let's see what can happen here. So, and then Daryl Baldock was very persuasive, and you know, he was just very persuasive. So I thought, well, yeah, we'll do that. And the difference when stepped in the door was just a standard performance of training. Fellas, you know, in those days, quite frankly, would walk in, and I don't exaggerate this, but they might have a half a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken as they walked into training. Like, they had no intention of training. You know, they had no intention of getting something out of the night. I don't know, even really still to this day, understand why they even bothered to come to training, you know, with that sort of attitude. And things were, you know, getting knocked off from the place, and when you'd put something down and it'd be gone, you'd ask about it, and, you know, just scratching your head saying, what is going on here? And anyway, a few got together and started to lift that, like as many had tried over times. But, you know, when you're that desperate for a few bucks and that desperate for, like as we were, and I certainly found that as when I stepped in the door of management as coaching, you know, it was really tough. It was probably an uneven playing field in comparison to Carlton back them days. You know, so it was pretty tough. But at the end of the day, there was enough players there and enough really good people in amongst the place for us to bob our head up again. And then we sort of went down a bit, and then we bobbed up again, and we went down a bit, and we bobbed up again, and down a bit, and here we are again, you know.
Sounds like 150 years of St Kilda Footy Club.
Yeah, that does, doesn't it? And it's, but it's a tough competition. You know, it's interesting to see during that time, from that time to now, how many teams have played the most finals. And I think it might be Geelong and West Coast. I think it might be. You know, the powerful clubs. And, you know, if you look at the West Coast, they've, like, powerful in every area. And then if you look at Geelong, well, you know, to get 7 father sons is sort of a stroke of luck, I reckon. Yeah. and a couple like an Ablett, you know, makes a bit of a difference. And, you know, and that's what I found the difference. But what I really loved about the Saints, you know, apart from the nightclub and the and all the fun and the, you know, the animal enclosure and just the real passion and the humour of St Kilda supporters is just it's unique, and it's just gold. And the nervousness of a St Kilda supporter. You know, when you might have won 3 in a row, but they're not expecting to win the 4th one in those days. They're sort of saying, "Shit, it's coming." You know, we're gonna cop it. You know, and you might be walking by somebody in the footy, and they'd be nervous as kittens. But just to get through that and grow through that, you know, it's taken a lot of years. But I sort of sense where the Saints are getting there now. Yeah, is it? I don't know. Help. It probably a bit of insight into it.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. So when, as Nick's saying, when you've walked in the door there and over the 3 years that you've played there, did you find that you changed yourself a bit? Did you yourself have more impact in changing anything that you did, or was it the club itself and the people around you that sort of changed how you played or how you did things, or just? Well,
I worked out pretty quickly, and Doc said to me, "Kenny, you're slowing down a bit. We might try you in the back pocket." And I said, "Well, that's a pretty good move, actually, because the ball's always down here, right?" And then, you know, so we had a bit of a laugh about that. And so I started my career in the forward pocket, went into the centre and ruck roving, and ended up in the back pocket, right? So did the whole gambit. And I couldn't believe really how simple it was to play in the back pocket. Like, just read the ball off the opponent's boots, and time again, you could just intercept. So the intercept mark and the link up handball and switch direction of play. And because the forward pressure that's in the game today wasn't in the game in those days. So, you know, if you got a kick, you mightn't have anyone around you for a couple of metres, and you could sort of take a bit of time and zig and zag and do that sort of stuff. But it was, you know, the players. Look, we had some wonderful players, but you've got to get your wonderful players playing most of your games for most of the year. And, you know, all of us would have some injuries here and there, so we're always disrupted. And then when you went for the depth, we sort of didn't have it because we weren't necessarily such a destination club. You know, people would perhaps go to Collingwood rather than come to St Kilda, or they would go to, you know, Geelong, or they would go to Carlton, or they would go to Essendon, you know, and we would miss on many occasions. So St Kilda went through a strategy. If you remember back then, they approached quite a number of Carlton players in that time. And then a few years later, they approached quite a few Hawthorn players. So there was Paul Harding, Peter Russo, Robert Hanley, and a number of others, and then Chris Whitman and others, Russell Morris, Sean Ralph Smith, you know, and all those players brought those experiences from those successful clubs into the fabric and framework of the St Kilda lifestyle. And all that started to help, started to sort of fill the jug, so it was a little more, you know, a little more professional.
So 1990, you take over as coach. It doesn't happen much these days that people end up coaching guys that they've directly played with as teammates, and especially that soon, where you're a teammate in '89 and then a coach in 1990. How did that go? I mean, and I guess you look at some of the big personalities like Tony Lockett. I imagine you would have learned a bit from playing with him that then helped you coach him.
Yeah, well, Darren, Tony and I, you know, were advocate for how good he was as a player. I believe he's the best footballer I've ever seen play the game. I was very fortunate to have Peter Hudson at my right-hand side too, as director of football, and you know, they're another great forward. So there was a bit of an insight there. Not that they were, you know, they were a bit different in a lot of ways, but they were both exceptional players. And I also had Stewie Lowe, who's one of the, you know, finest players that I've ever seen play the game. Tough, resilient, hard, you know, 20 marks a week, just enormous play under duress. And Lockett was like that also. Nicky Winmar is one of the greatest players I've ever seen play the game. Gilbert McAdam, David Grant across half back, Danny Frawley at fullback, and, you know, if could have played Danny in the midfield, like how good might have he been in there? Like there was just all these machinations of this team. And as you said in your introduction, you know, Nathan Burke, Robert Harvey, Mickey Dwyer, Kane Taylor, all these ferrets, all these kids were just coming through then. You know, they were right in their infancy. But to really answer the core of the question, it was to get their buy-in and earn their and gain their respect and their trust, right? Explain to them what we were doing, ask them for a contribution, and they did contribute. Those blokes all put together, and Jerry Ryan was funded it, of JK Caravans, but all those boys got together and worked their butts off to revamp the facilities that we had down there and paint them and, you know, all that sort of stuff. And then design the training drills, right? So it's not all about me saying bang. It was more about the players saying, well, okay, how can we work that out? So they got some buy-in and we're sort of trying to get, I don't know, 3 years out of 2 with them, you know, in terms of footy maturity by teaching them to drink rather than giving them a drink. That was sort of the philosophy. And, you know, I didn't have too many blues, you know, over the years. I got a couple of them tell me to get stuffed, and that's fine. And I had a couple of them stick it up your whatever, and that was fine. But it's never easy to tell a kid or anyone that, you know, you'd like them to be doing something different than they see that they're different, like their expectation's a little different to reality from what you're doing. And that's one of the toughest things of the coach, you know, when you've got to tell a player that he's been dropped or he's been traded or, you know, or he's ended his career at the club. It's, you know, it's pretty incredible. One of the funny ones with that was Jimmy Cracker. So Jimmy, we recruited through the mid-season draft. We got 2 great players, or we got a number, but Jimmy got 36 possessions in his first game versus the Bulldogs. My first game ever coach. Tony Lockett kicked 10 goals. Mickey Dwyer was enormous. And Timmy Pekin played on the wing. And Timmy was a June pickup as well. So, but Jimmy Crack at the end of the road had come, and I met him in those days down behind the back of the stand where the old officers were at Moorabbin there. And I said, I need to see you upstairs later, Jimmy. And he said, don't worry about it, Bomb. He says, I know what you're doing. He said, it's been good. You know, the end of the time's come. You haven't got a redback, have you? $20. He snipped me for on the line. Got me a beauty. And but he's a wonderful. Yeah, he played some good footy. But he was just well, it's about knackered. I think he was about 32 at that point.
What was the driving force for you taking the senior coach's role? I mean, you'd been at a powerhouse. You'd seen the other side and the lack of success and lack of modernity, I guess. But could you tell in 1990 when you took over that we were kind of on the cusp of maybe something special?
I knew we had some talent, right? You know, when you got Lowe, Lockett, Frawley and Grant, right? And I'd seen Winmar, Harvey and Burke, Jason Daniels, Mickey Dwyer. You know, you've seen these blokes really come together. You know, I knew we just needed a little bit of clarity, purpose, a little bit of direction. And Doc was good at that. He was wonderful, but he unfortunately suffered a medical condition, and you know couldn't keep coaching. So I went into what I thought was get one more year of playing, you know, because I thought, oh well, 184 games or whatever I am, and blah, blah, blah. I remember the 200 club night games and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I'll keep playing. I'll see what can happen. And, you know, we might go all right. I think I'll have another crack. Anyway, Murray said, no, don't worry about that, mate. He said, go home and think about coming back with the proposal to coach the club. So I did, and I put that together. There were a couple of documents which were fairly, well, I suppose, innovative at the time. And I was able to sit down in front of the board of directors, led by the president, Travis Payes, the vice president, Jerry Ryan, Des Kelly, Brian Healy, and, you know, some wonderful people. And in the end, they asked me back for a second interview, and then they asked me back a third time, and they said, we'd like you to consider taking on the role. So then I shit myself.
Do you recall what some of those innovative measures were at the time that would have been brand new to the club or to the competition?
Yeah, there was a bit of that, but you know, it's just getting the basics right, eliminating excuses. Like we would have a player that might slip over in the Moorabbin mud. Now that can happen to anybody. Stops have fallen out. Right? And then, well, why have his stops fallen out? Like Jimmy Scott's been doing the stops there for years. He's knocked them in. What's going on? And you go into that boot room and it was mouldy and wet, the heater, you know, no heater, broken. Been asked 40 times to be fixed, but never been fixed, you know? So the boots were just like the footies. You train with footies that were like balloons. And it's just stuff like that. Just getting that right. You know, we had leg press. We had it in the dunnies on the old wing, you know, which was locked up and closed because we couldn't pay the bill to keep the dunnies open. Like the plumber eventually said, no, enough's enough. And all of a sudden, all this gym equipment went in there in the padlock. And then, you know, a couple of years later, I found out we're actually still paying a lease on that bit of gym equipment. So it's a pretty amazing stuff back them days. Little bits and pieces, you know. And as sort of life goes on, the stories, they become a little bit more, I don't know, you sort of tell them with a little bit more probably, or not as realistic as perhaps they were, but all that stuff really hurt us. And so we went to Sandringham Football Club and offered them to put the lights up there. And we did that for $3,500 it was back then. We didn't have it, but we found it somehow and put those lights up, and they allowed us to train through the final series at that oval, because the Moorabbin Oval in those days, like it was built on a tip, And if we got some rain, our players would be pulling calf muscles or hammies, all very sore because of the mud. So you get down playing on the go down and train down there, and come Saturday at Waverley, which is a huge big ground, and that's where the finals were played in those days. Our blokes running on top of the ground flying, just the preparation of it. So just little things like that, videos up behind the goals to just show players, you know, where they were and shouldn't be running, or things like that. Like, you know, you got Lockett that's a superstar, 4 blokes hanging off him. Well, get out of the bloody way and just drum it at the front, you know. Don't try and compete with him. And most times he'd win them anyway. And it was good to see, just on that, a little segue, but into Cox's, big Cox for Collingwood, kicking those 3 goals in 3 minutes the other night, just took me right back to Tony Lockett. You know, just to see him do that, you know. And I was reading through a couple of the records in preparation for tonight, like kicking 10 goals, 12 goals, 15 goals, 9 goals, 7 goals, 8 goals, like just huge stuff, magnificent stuff.
So you talked about how your transition to coaching was. How did the players that you had played with, how was their reactions? Did they take it on board? Oh, this is quite easy, or was there a few that were a bit like, oh, I'm not too sure about this?
No, I don't think so. I think I was, you know, well, you'd have to ask them, but from my point of view, I selected them or not selected them, dropped them or ended their career, basically, you know, which all happened with a few of those blokes. Like, the great mates of mine at Carlton and great mates while I was playing at St Kilda, but at the end of the day, when, you know, it's years later, some of those relationships are not so much fractured, but, you know, you're mates, but you're not great mates, which you might have been, you know. And there are players like that. You know, there are players like, I'll just name a couple, like Jason Daniels, for example, or Timmy Allen, for example. You know, just wonderful people, wonderful players. We're trying to swap them out the door for other players in. And, you know, it just really hurts in the long run. But you got to try and do those things. You know, you got to try, but you can't get them right all the way, mate. And that's the same with when you're, you know, settle up with, you know, players that you played with. Yeah, it's, you know, not easy, but you get through it.
Always look at some of the numbers of that era, and you spoke about Tony Lockett. I mean, between 89 and 92, he kicked 402 goals in 63 games. It's beyond extraordinary, the run he had in that period. I mean, in 89, if he wasn't injured, he would have kicked 170 or something. And in 1991, he missed 7 games and kicked 127 goals. So if he maintained the average, he kicks 170 odd in that period. But 89 Docs last year, we were 6-4 and then lost about 7 games by less than 10 points. And then 1990 in your first year, I reckon we were 7-5 or 7-6. And then similar thing happened. And 91, it clicked and all fell into place. So I think we got the wobbles a little bit, but then came back with a streak of wins and made the finals. Can you sort of take us through that year and I guess what it meant to break through in 1991?
Yeah, well, we always got the wobbles at some point in a season back in those days. And interesting, even in today's football, a lot of clubs still get a bit of the wobbles, you know, for 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks where they can't quite snag a game. You know, and whether that's just the ability just to, well, you hear the word composure, you know, a lot in today's footy. We used to coach that all the time, but there's so much with composure. It's on the field and off the field. It's approaching the contest, it's in the contest, and it's after the contest, you know, and that's hard to do for 25 weeks in a Melbourne winter, you know, pretty hard to do. And the level of professionalism, the level of well, the excuses that players could find if they needed to or wanted to. Like, it's a different world today, the AFL football scene, than it was then. But it was on its way, and yeah, that's why I think those sort of you know, injuries, like that season you talked about, 89. I reckon Tony had round 10, I reckon he had round 9 maybe even had 90, maybe 70 goals it was.
71 goals in 9 rounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An amazing thing. And then he gets injured. And the teams used to play in a certain way. The opposition can try and stop him, but as I said, they couldn't. Yeah. When he was half injured, they might have, but when he's fully fit in those days, it was just, it was pretty incredible. So, yeah, and late in that season, Darryl Bulldogs Genius, he put Nicky Winmar at full forward, opened up the forward line, and Nicky kicked 8, 6, 4, just brilliant, because you couldn't beat him one-on-one either. And, that's sort of the thing. If you look at footy, you've got to be able to win the one-on-ones. You've got to have skill, and skill's got to be able to stand up under fatigue, and also under a bit of a jolt mentally. In those days, whether it be a knock or whether it be a bit of verbal or it be whatever, something else, you've got to be able to run. You've got to be able to make good decisions. You've got to have the desire to want to keep competing and persist to endure. And as we talked about, that composure. But then there's got to be something that's bigger than all that. And it's, that word teamwork. And players have got to learn to care and give and just have an awareness that together, they do achieve more. And it's we. The ability to say thanks and the ability to talk in a tone, not an aggressive, to do it right. All those little things have to come into that player's persona to be, to come out on top, if you like, and play finals. Now, to play in the finals in those days, you had to win about 12 games out of 22, or 11 out of 20. That sort of name, and that's if you look at it, back to those coaches we talked about. If you have a season where you're sort of doing under 50% win-loss record, you don't last long. So the way it sort of ends up. And interesting to have a look. I don't know, players. You play 100 games, play 4 years. How many games do you play? How many do you win? How many do you lose? It's pretty interesting. Our numbers, at least as a club now, St Kilda are on the up. They're on the up, which is a good thing.
You're one of the few St Kilda coaches to have a win-loss record over 50%. I think yours stands at 55%, so that's something to be pretty proud of. But what was, Paco mentioned that that 91 season. What were the fundamentals of your coaching style and the behaviour that was required, and what was it that clicked in 91?
Yeah, well, I think just the maturity of those players. They were getting games into them. Those things I talked about before, those probably 9 or 10 key elements of a successful player, a successful person in football on the footy field. If you're a coach and you hone on, let's just say Jason Daniels, perhaps kicking mightn't have been one of his strengths, or perhaps physical fitness, Tony Lockett, like an asthmatic and prone to be a little overweight, mightn't have been one of his real strengths. So you'd have a month or 2 or 3 where, or a player mightn't be that tuned into training and, continually late, or all the different things that happened in those days. You'd be very careful not to hone in on those things too often, where you piss the bloke off and a few of his mates and a few of his family and a few of his friends and a few members and a few supporters and and all of a sudden you've got a bit of a tidal wave going on. So you've got to be very careful to have an awareness of all that sort of stuff. And so to get across that, you kept throwing things back at the playing group and asking them the questions on how we should be training and having them take the training drills. Like have a Dean Rice take some handball drills, or a Mickey Dwyer take some tackling drills, or a Gilbert McAdam, take some marking drills, or whatever it might be. Nicky Winmar take some kicking drills. Like it just went on and on and on. And so you just worked on their strengths. Now our strengths were to win that ball in the middle and get it down there quickly to a Lockett and a Lowe. Like it made sense, yeah? And as was talked about earlier, Tony, subject to injury, was essentially unstoppable, as was Dunstall at Hawthorn, as was Ablett at Geelong. We were lucky that we had Spud that could pretty much nail both of those blokes. No club had anyone that could knock off Tony. You know, it's pretty, it's pretty good. But they also had really talented players in midfield. And so what would happen is, there's some big scores kicked in those days. Like you get 60, 70, 80,000 people at MCG and you'd see 35 goals kicked. It's pretty fantastic stuff, like really good footy. But when it broke down, a poor execution of a skill, a lack of effort just to run again from someone, or a poor effort to tackle, or a missed goal, which still happens today, even though they're kicking off carpet. The defence wasn't in the game as it is today. So the opposition would then get a break on you. But our operation, if you like, a modus of operation, was to win the 50-50 ball, win the one-on-one, and get it quickly down in there to the Locketts and Lows. And if that wasn't on, have the strength of mind to keep trying to go through the middle. Keep trying to go through the middle. Because what would happen is the opposition would stick numbers back in the corridor, and our blokes, and just wash my hands, when they weren't tuned in mentally, would just get wider and wider and wider and go off the screen, and, they build defences to keep them in. Yeah? So you had to keep pulling them back in just to keep bashing the ball through there. Now, there was something else in footy those days. So if you were sitting back in the hole and you had a Low or a Lockett and their knees are that wide, like the great one with Rodney Maynard was, Rocket, I wouldn't stand there too long. So it's just after half time at Moorabbin that was. So, there's Rodney Maynard for the Adelaide Crows just shitting himself for the first 15 minutes of the third quarter. And gets steamrolled, So you had to really just, and mental strength, just to keep working through that. You just had to keep growing as a group.
So speaking of honing in on something and coaching advice and that sort of thing, Queen's birthday, 1992, you've decided to walk down to defence, hone in on one player in particular.
Yeah.
And what did you say to him that made him resent it so much that he'd come out and kick the winning goal?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Was that his only reply, or?
That's good, yeah. That's the only way he could reply. Look, Craig was an extremely talented player. Craig Devonport we're talking about. Played 100 games with the club. Kicked 5 goals in a game. Kicked 5 goals in a quarter. There's very few players that had that talent. Extremely talented basketballer and a lovely young fella. But for those very reasons that I just talked about, some of our players had a tendency to try and grab the ball out here rather than pushing it through there. And it'd work, and when it worked, it looked good. But when it didn't work, it would go, for example, over to a Tony Francis, to a Scotty Russell, to a Mick McGuan, straight into, banging and Collingwood to go, like time and time again. So you just had to keep these blokes in the funnel, and they could either crumb it or pressure it somehow. Anyway, he did kick the winning goal, and unbelievably, he crumbed it off the boundary line. But I love that. And actually, there was 2 great reporters, of which one was Michael Sheehan, and they split us up as we walked into the rooms afterwards. So 2 old pro reporters, and they got an answer off Craig and an answer off me, which we hadn't had time to collaborate our answer. And frankly, I can't even remember what was said, but it was more like, hey, mate, we've trained at this all year. How about you get the front and square? And might have been said a little different than that. But I was a bit stiff. There were 80,000 people all looking down the other end, and one bloody photographer that would see me jump out of the box and go down there. Just one on that, though. The great Peter Hudson said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm just going down there." He said, "Oh, I'm not sure I'd do that."
One of the most iconic moments. But obviously 91 finals, we lose an absolute classic to Geelong. 1992, we beat Collingwood at Waverley and then lose to Footscray. So we're tracking up. 93, we had some great wins. Beat Collingwood at Victoria Park, beat Carlton at Princess Park, beat Geelong by 15 goals at Waverley. Beat North Melbourne twice, and they were on top of the ladder for most of the year, but obviously had some lapses and missed the finals. And we spoke to Nathan Burke a bit about it, and he said that the club had a habit of being impatient, where something like that would happen and that they'd make a snap decision and sack a coach, for example, saying when really you've got to hold your nerve, and it's situations like that where that can happen. And we only went 10-10. It wasn't a disaster. Can you take us through your departure, because it seems on most measurements to not exactly be fair based on the run of the team?
Yeah, no, I think you summed it up pretty well. I think Nathan's given you a pretty good reflection of what happened. But then also from my point of view, like, you know, I was 33 and probably a bit immature too, you know, so sort of the meetings that went on about where the club and how we were going to go forward and what we were going to do, and you know, who they wanted to sell and who they wanted to know. It was all, I didn't really necessarily agree with most of it or all of it. And I thought we could go another level the following year as all the things we've talked about started to manifest and mature, and the players were hungry for another run at it. You know, and loyalty, like strength through loyalty is our slogan. And I reckon that one's pretty right. You know, like we had a group of players that were coming through together, and, you know, you got to love them. Like they, you know, 300 plus games, a number of them that are all just top line fellas, and great families and just fantastic. And, you know, we've been so close, but why have we only been so close? Probably that bit of impatience is one of the keys. And if you look at some great examples that are talked about every time a premiership coach and his team win one, and that coach could have been sacked 5 years ago, but the club held his nerve. Like Bomber Thompson's good, Hardwick is good, examples of that. You know, and there are others. It didn't quite happen that way with me, and I went and coached elsewhere and did other things, and, you know, had a wonderful life, and it hasn't worried me. But that, yeah, we just sort of never connected when it probably really mattered at that time. In the middle of that season, we'd lost too many games in a row in the middle of that year, and that's where the outside noise that I talked about starts to get people. You get some jittery, and when you've got a couple that aren't in your corner, that's how easy it can happen. And votes have only got to go 5-5, and the president's got you, and it's only got to go the other way a bit, and you're out. You know, 4-6, done. Cool.
You mentioned,
I don't know what votes were, by the way, but that's how simple it is to me.
You mentioned that there were some disagreements with the board or with the president around the direction of the club, and was there anything in particular that was kind of a fundamental no from you that you completely disagreed with, or that was potentially the straw that broke the camel's back and the thing that made them go, hang on, we've got to move Ken on?
Yeah, it probably was. Like that they had some pretty good plans, which in the end, you know, Tony Lockett went to Sydney. Like we had Collingwood offer $1 million cash for him 2 years before. Well, you know, that cash would have been good, but what would have we done? You know, we wouldn't have played in finals. We wouldn't have done it. You had to give people hope. You know, we had to give people hope, and you know, I wanted to obviously keep Lockett. They did the year, but then the year later off he went. You know, so that was pretty instrumental from my point of view. But you know, it's just the way things turn out. Sometimes it just happens that way. And for me, it was, you know, up the track, see you later. But I sort of never offended by anybody or never offended anybody, I don't think. It was just the way that it unfolded. And, you know, I still see most of those people most years somewhere at footy functions somewhere, and always have a laugh and a smile and just keep rolling. So it's, you know, no real drama. But I think, really fortunate to have had a crack at coaching league footy. Really enjoyed it. But, you know, 4 years was the end of the road for me.
Now, you saw Plugger both on the field and from the coach's box. Which would be one day that you'd go back to just to be able to watch again? Like, you got the win against Carlton in kicking the 10. You got the dozen against Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide. Quite a few bags there. Is there one that really sticks out? You just love to sit there and watch that one once more?
Yeah, probably that last quarter of the 92 last home and away game when Carlton played Melbourne. Now, I might have this wrong, but this is what I reckon happened. We were maybe half a goal either behind or in front at three-quarter time. We had to win to get in the finals. And the three-quarter time speech, with the quick consult with Danny and Tony, was if we just open it up, because Stewie Lowe wasn't playing this day. He had a bleeding kidney. Was able to recover, thankfully, in time to play in the final the following week. We played Danny Frawley centre-half forward. And I said, Danny, we get everybody out of the forward line, and no matter if they've got 4 or 14 back in there, we're just going to bomb it on Tony's head. And Plugger, you can kick 4, can't you? And he said, I can kick 4. And that's exactly what happened. Kick 4 goals, and we went into the finals. So it was pretty simple. And I've never seen that quarter of footy, but that's probably the answer. And I could be so far off it, but I think that's what happened.
No, you're spot on. At three-quarter time, we were 2 points down. We kicked 4 in the last quarter. He kicked all of them. The highlights of that game are on YouTube. I don't know if the whole game is, but the highlights are up there. He kicks one from the boundary. I think we were kicking to the punt road end in the last quarter, if that serves me correctly. But yeah, quite remarkable. But yeah, I actually heard.
And the ground in the day was, like the weather is this week. Like it was just muddy and wet.
Yeah.
And plus, on top of that, we had the pressure of having to win to play in the finals, which was something that our players weren't used to. So to get over that was quite meritorious of them. And then the following week, we knocked off the Magpies by 8 points, which was one of the greatest days of my life enjoyed in footy. To see the jubilation on the players, their families, the staff, their families, and the St Kilda people was just out of this world. It was an incredible day.
Yeah, my dad speaks often about that day. I think he took me there as a very, very young man. But we appreciate you joining us on the program. Your journey with the Saints was extremely memorable. Some remarkable games, some remarkable moments, and put the club into a position where we hadn't been for a generation or more. So you should be certainly very proud of that. And as we let you go, a question you might have been asked once or twice over the journey: when Wayne Harmes knocked you that ball in the grand final, was it out of bounds?
Well, I'm not sure, Darren, but the answer that I always give to those questions, and 95% of them are from Collingwood supporters, so this is a rare one. It's not from a Collingwood supporter. It happens every day of my life until probably the last 2 or 3 years. It started to drop off a bit, and it's probably only happened twice this week, and you're the second time. But seeing you both for the Saints and not the Pies, I'll say, well, it was just in. I thought it was just in, and the umpire was correct. But if you're a Collingwood supporter, I say, mate, you wouldn't believe it. And you tell them a bit of bullshit and say that it's been proven scientifically it was out of bounds, and geez, they go off. But anyway.
And then you can talk to them about 92 as well. But Ken, thank you. Great to get some stories from you, and we appreciate you giving us so much of your time today.
No, pleasure, fellas. Good on you, and see how you go. This will be exciting, isn't it, this weekend? So let's fingers crossed.
Yeah.